Welcome, everyone, to the workshop Archiving 101, Introduction to Archives for Community Organizations. My name is Marina Czerniawska, and together with my colleague, Irena Jędrzejewska, we will be your instructors for today. I would like to let you know that this event is organized jointly by the National Archives Committee of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and Sustainable Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Program at the Kule Folklore Center, University of Alberta. Over to you, Irena. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Irena Jędrzejewska. I'm Edmontonian. I live and breathe Edmonton. Have been working in the heritage field for almost 30 years, and I have an MA in Ukrainian and a master's in Library and Information Studies. And before I retired, I was the Director of Access and Preservation Services at the Provincial Archives of Alberta. Yeah, I'm very interested in archives and making sure that our community keeps their records safe and for the future.
Thank you, and I would just like to add that you are also a member of the Archives Committee of the National UCC Archives Committee. Just a few words about myself. I'm originally from Chernivtsi, Bukovina. I work as an archivist at the Kule Folklore Center, University of Alberta, which is in Edmonton. Soon to be 10 years since I started. I have an MA in Ukrainian folklore and Master of Library and Information Studies, both from the University of Alberta. And I'm a co-chair of the UCC Archives Committee. In my other archival role, I work as a database administrator for the Archives Society of Alberta. So some of you had more technical questions, and I hope we can cover some of those as well. A few housekeeping items to start with. This meeting is being recorded, and we will make it available online. As you probably noticed, this is a webinar, Zoom webinar, so all the attendees have their cameras and phones off. There is a chat function. If you have any immediate question or require some clarification, feel free to type it in the chat. We will monitor it. If you have more bigger questions about archives and archiving, please put them in the Q&A section. Because we have over 50 people registered, we may not get to all the questions, and I know some of you included questions within your registration, but we will make sure to follow up on all of them. We will compile them in a file, combine similar questions, and we'll send you answers after the webinar. We will also share slides with you, so whatever you see on the screen, you don't have to take notes unless you want to. All the links, all the information will be provided to you after the event, as well as other resource materials that will be mentioned during the workshop. And let's get started. First thing, I would really like to emphasize that this is a 1.5 hour webinar, a workshop. It's only an introduction to archiving, as it says in the title. I would even say that it's an introduction to archiving. Usually, archival professionals get graduate degree to practice as archivists. And obviously, we can't cover all the materials that people learn during 2 years of full-time studies during this short workshop. But we do hope to offer more webinars in the future. We will be offering workshops on specific aspects of archiving. For example, we'll be doing preservation, we'll be doing digital preservation, electronic record keeping, and different other aspects. So please stay tuned, subscribe to UCC mail list or to such network mail list, and we will keep you posted of these developments. The next workshop that we will be offering is electronic records management, and we hope to offer it in September. There's no date yet, but please stay tuned, and we will announce it with time. I would like to mention that archivists, especially now in this day and age when digital technologies and everything is moving so fast and changing so fast, everybody has to keep up with their professional development. There is never an end point. Now I've learned everything and I can practice. Everybody has to keep on learning. So in a way, we're all in this together, because we are learning as we practice, as we read, as we learn about new developments in the field of archives. This workshop is aimed primarily at community organizations, although it may be interesting and useful to individuals or families who also want to preserve their own family archives. This is the outline of today's workshop. As you see, there is a lot that we're hoping to cover. We can't go into detail on any of these, but again, as I mentioned, in the future, workshops will be offered basically for each of these items that are mentioned on the screen. So in order for us to be on the same page and to have a meaningful conversation about archives, we have to start with clarifying some terminology. So what are archives? Usually, archives have three meanings. One meaning is materials, records created or received by a person, family, or organization, public or private, in the course of their business, and preserved because these records have permanent value, because of the information they contain, or because of the evidence that they have. Another meaning of the archive is the organization that collects such records of individuals, families, or organizations. And also it is used within the meaning of a building that houses archival collections. We will be talking about archives today, mostly using the first definition. So just please keep that in mind. The International Council on Archives offers a slightly different definition of archives. Archives are the documentary byproduct of human activity retained for their long-term value. They're contemporary records created by individuals and organizations as they go about their business, and therefore provide a direct window on past events. You might have noticed the word records several times already in these definitions, and archival records are really the word that we will be using as well. Record is the information that has been fixed on some medium. It can be any type of medium. It can be paper, it can be tape, it can be slides, it can be anything, but it has to be fixed, documented on some medium. This information is used as this fixing of the information is used as an extension of human memory or to demonstrate accountability, and is preserved as evidence of individual or institutional activity. So to summarize it all, archival, and in simple words, archival records are usually unique. They're unpublished materials. They don't need to be old. A record created a month ago or a year ago can have archival value. Most often, archival records are non-active records, which means you don't use them on a regular basis. They come in a wide range of analog and digital form, and pictures in the screen give just a few examples, and they have a long-term enduring value. So let's look at archival value. Again, this term you will hear over and over again, and it is often used interchangeably with permanent value or enduring value. It's the ongoing usefulness or significance of records based on the administrative, legal, fiscal, evidential, or historical information they contain, justifying their continued preservation. Why are archives important? Well, since you are here, I think we don't need to explain or convince you that archives are important. Uh, I believe you know that they are, but I really like this definition by Sue McCamish. Archiving is a form of witnessing and memory making, a particular way of evidencing and memorializing our individual and collective lives, our existence, our activities and experiences, our relationships with others, our identity, our place in the world. And I think it is very fitting, especially in the context of community organizations, because archives really serve as expressions of community and identity. And in their own turn, they help shape that identity. So they are definitely very important for governments and public bodies, but they're as important for communities. There are different kinds of archives. There can be public, as I already mentioned, business, religious, university archives, community archives, and this list goes on and on. Just a quick note to help again clarify, many people confuse or feel confused about the difference between museums, archives, and libraries. All three are considered memory institutions. All of them work with information in this or that form. But these few points in the screen, I think, help understand better this difference and help differentiate between library materials and archival materials. So again, archives are usually unpublished records, while books or other publications in the library are published. Archives are unique, they're one of a kind, and in the library we see numerous copies, not necessarily in the same, but numerous copies across the world of the same book, for example. For archives, relationality and context are paramount. In the library, information is organized on the item level. Every single book, every single publication is treated as a discrete item. Archives are organized by its creator, while libraries organize their holdings by subject, by themes. Archives are described in groups. Very rarely archival descriptions exist on an item level. Very often it's the fond or collection level, or then series, and we'll get to this point a bit later in the workshop, but just a note for you to see this difference. And archives are usually stored in closed stacks, while libraries, at least here in North America, are stored in open stacks. A quick note about record keeping and archives. There are different models of record keeping and its relationship to archives, and this is just one of them, record lifecycle model. There's also record continuum model. What it basically means is that records are created, then they're used and maintained, and then they're either disposed of or they're transferred for permanent preservation, which means they go to archives and they become archival records. I won't stop at this for too long because, as I mentioned, we will have a records management workshop in the fall, so we will be able to look at it in more detail. So what archivists do, what archives do? They acquire, appraise, arrange, describe, preserve, and provide access to archival records of enduring value. In many cases, in community organizations especially, archivists also serve as records managers. If there is an archivist, most likely they perform the functions of records manager. So these people will decide what records will go into archives, what records will be saved permanently. And it is very important to understand how it is done. The first thing that is most important is for your organization, and this relates mostly to organizations, not so much to individual family archives. Your organization needs to have a mandate. You need to know what archival records you are preserving and why. Ideally, this commitment to maintain for example, your institutional archives should be documented in your bylaws or another statutory document. But this document, even if it's in the form of policy, it doesn't really matter, but it has to clearly identify what you maintain, what you collect, and what you do not collect. Nobody can collect everything, and going too wide usually means you wouldn't be able to take care of records that are really important for you. So identifying this collecting mandate or writing and developing an acquisition policy is extremely important. It may not sound very exciting, but we do believe it's very important, and we hope to have a separate session helping people to develop those policies and then hopefully take them back to their boards, discuss them with their boards, and hopefully approve and make them part of their founding documents. So through appraisal, archivists determine which records belong to archives and which need to be disposed of. There are several archival principles that archivists use when they make these decisions on what to acquire, how to arrange their archives. They're namely respect the fond, provenance, and original order. Respect the fond basically means that all archives from one creator or organization or individual or a family must be kept together as a unified whole, and they should not be mixed with archival records of another creator. Original order is a complex concept, but if you acquire records from an individual or from organization, the golden rule is to keep the order in which these records were created and maintained, hoping that such order exists, because as we all know, life happens, and especially with volunteer organizations, when volunteer roles often change, there may not be clear workflows or procedures that people follow, and records can be just stored in banker's boxes in someone's garage or in someone's attic. But if you can identify this original order, you should keep it, because this order, it provides contextual information about how records were created, why they were created, and it helps better understand the information that is contained within the records. As you can imagine, there are many challenges with this concept in practice. And this picture just illustrates one of those challenges, I guess. When this might easily happen when people collect everything, or organizations collect everything, or when there's no policies or no procedures, and it's difficult in this case to find original order, most definitely. Archives and ethics is a very dear to my heart topic. There are many things that we can talk about here, and I wish we had more interactive format for this workshop. Archivists serve as an access point. They provide access to records. They can prevent access to records. They are responsible for protecting personal information and privacy of people. Archives may contain sensitive information or documents about some traumatic events. When people talk about digitizing everything and making it all available online, it's not always good when you think about this kind of sensitivity in your records, because not all the records should be online. Not your creators of those records, who are stakeholders for you, they would not want to have them online, fully digitized and fully published. So it is the responsibility of an archivist to make sure that records are protected, people are protected, their privacy and personal information, but also culturally sensitive information. Very often legally, you may have all the rights to make the records available online, but legalities is just one part of side of things. There is also ethics. Trust is also very important in archives. Archivists need to build trust with people who contribute to the archives, who deposit their records into archives. You need to build that trust, and they need to believe that you won't overstep what they entrusted in you. Archivists try to make sure that records within their archives provide as full as possible representation of different groups. Well, in the case of provincial archives, for example, they would want to have representation of different indigenous peoples. They would want to have representation of different ethnic groups in their archives, everything that is related to the province in question, because this is their mandate. If it's a Ukrainian archival or heritage organization, they may have a mandate to document and have representation of various Ukrainian communities across Canada, or maybe even wider than that. The archives where I work, the Bohdan-Medvitsky Ukrainian Folklore Archives at the U of A, we have a mandate to document cultural expressions and history of Ukrainians in various diaspora communities, with a focus on Ukrainians in Canada, but also we have records about Ukrainians in Brazil, Ukrainians in Argentina, in former Yugoslavia, in Romania, in many, many different countries. So again, we are coming back to that mandate. You need to know what you're doing as an institution. Archivists have power, as you see in this picture in the screen. It's one of my favorite, and I have it printed out. It's hanging just above my desk at work so that everybody who comes into my office can see it and be nice to me. But speaking seriously, archivists used to be thought of as impartial custodians of records. However, in the last few decades, people came to realize that archivists have the power to decide what gets preserved for the future and what gets forgotten. They directly shape the future historical record. We shouldn't underestimate this power, and we should be as reflexive as possible about it and transparent, because we all have our own biases, we have our own filters. So exposing those is important for users of archives and for all the stakeholders of archives to better understand records themselves. And on this note, I will pass it on to Irena, who will talk about, let me stop sharing my screen, who will talk about copyright and privacy in archives. Let me just, 1 second, and I'll just share screen again.
Okay, copyright and personal privacy are two sides of a coin. They're too complex and many faceted, but archivists need to have a good understanding of the basic principles of these two issues, the legislation that is associated with them, and how they affect their archives, and how to address them from the two perspectives, from the acquisition point of view and from the making available point of view. Because of the time constraints today, I mean, as you know, I could talk about copyright and privacy for hours, but we won't. We will not do too much detail. We'll just talk about what we need to consider as archivists and how to prepare. So the copyright, slide 2, please. Marina, I'm just going to nod my head to continue.
Sounds good.
Okay. Copyright is a federal law that protects the copyright owner's right to copy. And usually the copyright owner is the author or the creator, but there are situations where that is not always the case. And the owner, the copyright legislation grants the copyright owner the sole and exclusive right to reproduce, perform, or publish a work. This gives the copyright owner control of their their creation, and the ability to benefit from it financially or otherwise. Okay, next slide, please. And a work can be a literary, drama, a music, art, sound recording, photographic piece, film, a performance, or broadcast. It must be original. It must be fixed in some form, and the copyright owner or holder must be a Canadian citizen or resident. Okay. The copyright lasts the lifetime of the author plus 50 years. How you calculate that is the year of the time of death of the author, the end of that calendar year, and then you add 50 years. Ensure best practices. You ensure you know who owns the copyright to the records you are acquiring, and get permission to share the donor's contact information with the researcher when the researcher needs to get permission to use. It is the responsibility of the researcher to ask permission to use copyright information, copyrighted information. So the donor is not necessarily the owner of copyright. For example, the easiest example is a photograph. The person who took the photograph is the copyright owner usually. But you may have a copy of the photograph in your archives that you are donating to an archives. So you don't necessarily hold that copyright, but you have the copy, you own the photograph. So there's a slight difference. So the archivist needs to untangle some of that when they discuss who owns copyright in the archives that is being donated. You need to discuss with the donor the options of assigning management of the copyright of the information in the archives that they are donating, perhaps to the best way to the institution to make it easier to manage the permission to use. In this case, the archives and the donor need to make the conditions of use in regards to copyright very clear and included in the donation agreement. You need to make sure the donor has the right to reassign the copyright to all the records they are depositing. Ownership of records and copyright may not be the same, as we've already talked about, as for example, the photo. If the donor does not own the copyright, you may need to contact the copyright owner for a discussion around acquiring that record and managing the copyright, or you may decide not to take it at all and not to acquire that record. Archives need to keep track of the record of who has used what records in regards to copyright. And you need to see, using the regulations for the Copyright Act of Canada, there is that need, because sometimes the copyright owner may come back and say, okay, who's used this stuff? And I want to see. Archives need to update their records regularly to ensure that they know when the term of copyright is up and when the work goes into the public domain. Once copyright expires, these records go into the public domain, and they are then free to be used by anyone without having to seek permission from the copyright holder. Researchers must be aware that they are responsible to seek copyright permission when they are using copyrighted material. You might consider putting that into the registration form so that that alerts the researcher when they register at your archives. So that's copyright in a nutshell, but there's lots more, and unfortunately, we're going to go on into personal information and protecting personal privacy. The basics. Personal information is information about an identifiable individual and can be the individual's name, home or business address or phone number, an individual's race, national or ethnic origin, color or religion or political beliefs or associations, any individual's age, sex, marital status or family status, any identifying number, symbol, or other particular that is assigned to that individual, the individual's fingerprints, other biometric information, blood type, genetic information or inheritable characteristics, information about the individual's health and healthcare, history, information about physical and mental disability, educational, financial, employment, or criminal history, including criminal records where a pardon has been given. All of that is someone's personal information. And this is sometimes difficult for people to understand, but anyone else's opinions about that individual is also that person's information. The individual's personal views or opinions, except when they are about someone else. Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Acts and Privacy Acts in the private sector, like in Canada and in certain provinces, who have their own individual ones. Alberta has, for example, Personal Information and Protection of Privacy Act. They define personal information clearly and also outline the responsibilities of organizations, including archives, when dealing with personal information, and it is good to be aware of them and the organization's responsibility to these acts. The purpose of these acts, whether it's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Acts or the Personal Information Protection of Privacy Acts, the purpose is to govern the collection, the use, and disclosure of personal information by organizations in a manner that recognizes both the right of the individual to have their personal information protected and the need of the organization to collect, the use, or disclose personal information for the purposes that are reasonable. There are specific situations where this legislation does not apply, and they may vary from province to province. So a look into the legislation in your province that applies to your archives and their regulations is important. You need to have a good understanding of what that is. For example, archives can collect personal information without consent if it is for archival or research purposes, but making the donor aware of the fact that researchers will be using the records is important to note. They may just want to be donating the records for their purposes to ensure that it's there forever, but they don't always consider that people are going to be looking at them. So there are discussions around privacy and protecting that privacy that need to happen. You need to get consent directly from the person from whom they are being collected. Especially if it's personal information. Tell them how their information will be used and how long you will keep it. For an archives, that's easy. You're going to keep it forever or as long as that piece of paper or film or whatever exists. So they have an understanding of how long that's going to be. Get the donor's permission to share their contact information with researchers when necessary, and understanding what that means when necessary. Usually it is a researcher may want to ask for copyright information or to use copyrighted information, or they may wish to have a conversation with the donor to get more information about something. So providing that information directly to the researcher is not a good practice unless you have the permission of the donor, or if you don't have that permission, you ask the donor first before sharing that information with the researcher. I'm sure people that are dealing with this kind of stuff on a daily basis already have a good understanding of that. At the point of donation, the donor may want to put some restrictions to the access of their archives. The archives should make sure that the option is discussed and the restrictions, if they are reasonable, are included in the donor agreement. Never being able to share that information is not a reasonable use or restriction. Being aware if and when there are times when the privacy legislation no longer applies is important, so that you can update your records to make access for researchers clear. For example, in Alberta, the protection of personal information no longer applies if that person has been dead for 20 years or more, or if the personal information about a person has been on a record for over 100 years or more, or in a record that has been in an archives for 75 years or more. But again, looking at the legislation and at the regulations of that legislation will give you a good understanding of when that happens. There may be circumstances where a research agreement is needed, where the personal information may be seen by the researcher, but the personal information may not be disclosed in their published works. So having that kind of an agreement, a contract that outlines those things and the liabilities around them is a good thing to have. Usually you can get an example at provincial archives or facilities that have research agreements already done. You can use it as an example. And then I've listed in the slides six references that are good references that will give you some information around this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. I can't recommend enough the top resource. It's a smallish publication, but it's really, really useful and very accessible. It's really good to have it at hand. And I think it is available online. All right, let's go back to archival policy. We already talked about institutional mandate more than once. Aside from that very important document, you also want to have several other policies or documents developed in your organization or in your institution. When someone donates you records, and Irina just talked about this, it's a good practice to have a document signed by the donor specifying transfer of physical ownership and or copyright to the archives. Any access restrictions, for example, nobody can see these records for the next 5 years, but after that, it's perfectly fine. And any other conditions. Some people do not want their records to be accessible over the internet. Some have some other restrictions. These two documents, as listed under the second bullet point, donation agreement or deed of gift, it varies from institution to institution what is used. I've met both equally frequently, I'd say, but archives usually are quite open to sharing these templates with other organizations. And the third bullet point that lists manual for small archives, it also has some templates based on an imagined organization, but it's a good starting point for drafting a donation agreement or a deed of gift. If you have access to a lawyer, of course, it's always a good idea to consult with them. But even if not, you can look through donation agreements or deeds of gift of other archival institutions and craft your own based on your own needs and your own circumstances, and ensure that you are protected as an organization and the donor is protected as well. So we talked about different archival functions, and the first was acquisition, and we talked a little bit how much mandate is important to for the archivists to help them decide what to keep and what to destroy. Appraisal is also the process that determines the value of records, and therefore it also helps make this decision. I listed here documents, types of records that are typically considered that they contain administrative or legal or fiscal value or evidential or research value. And these directly apply to community organizations, especially those run non-for-profits that are run by the boards. These are mostly, of course, this is not the full list, and there are many more, but there are also records that have temporary value, and those you usually don't want to keep for in perpetuity. The examples of those would be canceled checks or receipt books or notices of meetings, materials of other organizations. Very often there is a lot of correspondence happening between the organizations, and very often you receive promotional materials from other community organizations. Technically, they're not part of your archives, and it's not your responsibility to preserve those records and make them available. The next function I would like to talk about is arrangement. So you received these records, you clarified and decided that they fall within your mandate. You do want to keep them. You looked at the records and weeded out those that are that do not have permanent value, that have only temporary value, or duplicates or things like that. So how do you arrange what you decided to keep? And here again, these three archival principles help decide and understand the structure, how you arrange these records. Again, a reminder, records created by one person or family or organization are usually kept all together and separately from records created by another creator, by another individual or family or organization. If your organization has good record keeping practices, then most likely you will keep the same order. You will just rehouse those records into archival folders. You will probably keep the same names on the file folders, and you will create a finding aid or some other description that will help you and other users in the future to access these materials. If there is no original order or no order that is identifiable, then the archivist has to try to imagine how these records were created, try to recreate that original order, and yet necessarily make a note in the description that this order was imposed by the archivist, because this makes a huge difference for the end user of the record. Archives, and we are talking about Canadian archival practice, because different countries may have different traditions. So in Canada, archives are arranged hierarchically. So we have the top level, which is a fond or collection, and then we have series. We can have sub-series or not. This is not required. And then there are files, and then individual items within files. The difference between fond and collection, a fond in archival science is considered a group of records that was naturally created in the course of someone's activity or life, if it's an individual, while collection is an artificially created group of records. So someone purposefully went and collected all the records they could find related to Ukrainian immigration to Canada, let's say. So that would be a collection, and in the first case, it would be a fond. Very rarely archivists, as I think I already mentioned, describe archival records on all of these levels. A good rule of thumb would be to have a top-level description for all the records that you have before you go deeper to describe lower level and smaller groups of records that, especially those that have the highest potential to be used, or those that you know are already frequently used, and there are several other criteria. but very rarely archivists get to describing records on the item level. Canada has its own archival standard for describing archives. It's called RAD, Rules for Archival Description. It was created, developed, and adopted before even the international standard existed. So we should be proud of that. Unfortunately, it hasn't been revised since 2008, so it's long due, especially with the digital records that are now in everyone's life and practice. But there are still debates whether it's better to join the international standard or to revise the existing Canadian standard. Rules for archival description describe everything about the group of records, including the creator. The international archival standards, as opposed to that, they have different description standards for different entities. They have a separate standard for describing archival institutions that hold archival records. They have a separate standard for describing creators or other actors of archival records. And in this case, it could be, most often it's a creator, but it can be also a contributor. It could be a collector, it could be a broadcaster or interviewer or whatever role there is, but most often it's a creator. And then there is a separate standard for describing records themselves. When a finding aid is created, especially now with the ubiquitous use of online archival databases, the end user sees all of these three descriptions as one. For them, they're all integrated. And what it does, it provides context, which is so important in archives. When a researcher or anyone who is interested in a record looks at the description, they can see immediately what institution houses these records, who created, the biography or history of that creator, and also all the other circumstances of record creation and all the details about physical characteristics and things like that. RAD is about 500 pages thick, and it's big and large. It looks quite intimidating. I'm not encouraging you to look and read through RAD, but it is available as a PDF for free download from the Canadian Council on Archives website. It is listed in the end of the slides with a link. What it is very useful to do is to search for something. If you need to understand where to put some information into the description, it's really useful just to use the search function and to read that up. Modern archival databases also have built-in functionality for each field that has explanations taken from RAD that explain that this field is for this and this purpose. This is for you to describe this part of records and things like that. So that's really useful. A few more details about descriptions. So as I said, there are several standards. One for actors, usually it's a name, entity type, dates of existence. If it's an individual, then the date of birth and death. If it's an organization, it could be the date it was founded and the date it ceased to exist, or it continues to exist, which is quite a usual thing. And also a biographical note if it's an individual or a family, or history if it's an organization. And there are many, many more fields that exist, but these are the main ones, most important, and you don't really want to skip them. You do want to have them in your description of a creator. Names is, as you see, listed in plural, and it's a very useful functionality that comes again with in the digital age, comes with the databases very often, and it's very familiar, especially to those Slavic groups in Canada who use Cyrillics. Their names were spelled all kinds of ways. As I'm sure you well know, one family can have 5 different spellings of the same last name because an immigration officer recorded it that way, because some came with the Austro-Hungarian passport, therefore the passport was in German, and some came from the territory that was Poland, and it has Polish spelling of Ukrainian name, a Polish rendering of Ukrainian Slavic name. So the functionality of online archival databases allows you to have all these variants of the name as parallel versions. And when you search, or when the researcher searches for one of them, all of them are linked. So they will inevitably find the record, which is extremely useful and which obviously wasn't possible in an analog form of a finding aid. And archival description template, the form that you can use to create a description, is even larger than for creators. These are just the top most important fields that I listed. The title of that font or collection or series. Very often, because it's not published material, if you take a book, you know what its title is. If you take a file folder with archival records, there is usually no title. So very often you as an archivist, you supply the title to this group of records. And very often it is based on the name of the creator. So for example, Ukrainian Canadian Congress font, or Andrew Grigorovich font. So usually you use the name of the creator, whether it's organization or an individual, and then you add a font or collection at the end. It is important to indicate the level of description in your archival description. Dates of creation, people often mix them with dates of existence that you can see higher up when we talked about the creator. Dates of creation relates specifically to the creation of records. So if dates of existence are about creators, so when someone was born and died, or when organization was created and ceased to exist, in this case, it's about records. So I have records of a family, for example, and the earliest record is their Austrian passport that they came to Canada with, and it dates back to 1895. So this would be the first date of creation. And then the latest piece of, the latest record that I have within this group of records is a photograph created in 2008, let's say. I'm making it up as I go, but the dates of creation in this case would be 1895 to 2008. There are different ways that archivists can show the end user, the researcher, and also to themselves that there are certain, that the records predominantly span only 2 decades, let's say, within this century, right? So I may have records that are from 1895 to 2008, but it's only 2 of them. And maybe the rest of the records originate from 1970s. So there is a way to indicate it in the archival description. You always have the range, the furthest, but you also can say that predominantly it's this decade or these decades. There are different ways of formatting those dates, and we will be talking about this more when we do a workshop on archival description specifically, because that requires a lot of hands-on show and tell and try and exercises. I hope that will be much more interactive. Physical description is another very important field to use for description, because it gives you understanding what it is you have from the physical perspective and how much of it you have. So if it's all paper-based, the usual form to write it down is the number of meters of textual records. And archivists measure them as linear meters, so you don't have to do cubic meters, anything like that. Basically, it's just your archival boxes on archival shelves, and you measure them as you look at them, you can measure them. So this would be your linear meter. When it comes to photographic records or audiovisual, especially records, very often archivists count them and they provide the number. So like in the case of this, the example that you see on the screen, it's 3 audio cassettes and maybe 5 reel-to-reel tapes and 55 photographs. So this physical description, you don't care here what these records are about. You just describe physicality and the size of them. Custodial history is another very important field. Custodial history is a field that helps you explain the history of these records after they were created and before they got into your archives, before they were deposited into your archives. Sometimes it happens that a person who created those records directly donated them to you, but very often there are multiple scenarios happening in between. For example, a person passed away and the children or someone who took care of the estate, they cleaned the house, they put the records in the box, they might have organized them somehow, and they may not know about original order and its importance. They might have weeded out some of them, or children decided that this personal information should not be publicly available, so they took it away. For the archivist, it is very important to talk to the donor, whoever brings you those records, to try to find out as much as possible about this history, what happened with those records before they got into your door. And you record this in this field, custodial history. Scope and content is probably one of the most important fields, which I say about each of these. So please bear with me. But scope and content, when I look at someone's archives, when I'm looking for something as a researcher, not as an archivist, I always look at the scope and content first, because this field lets you know about the content, the subject, the aboutness of those records. So this is where I learned that this is about Latvian immigrants and their relationship with neighboring Ukrainians or things like that. So this is the topicality of the records that you describe here. And there are many, many more fields, especially for archival description. It's huge. And the convenience, again, a convenience of online databases is that if you don't fill out those fields, the end user won't see them. So it won't be cluttered with empty fields. They will see only those fields that have value, which is very handy, of course. And you can always go back and add more information to your description as you learn more about these records. Well, I said so many times archival databases that I probably don't need this slide anymore. But I would like to say that there are many different options. Most organizations decide to use an archival database nowadays, although you may want to simply keep the list of everything in a spreadsheet. That's better than not having a list of anything. So it's totally up to you. It's up to your organization and the technical abilities of people. But technology is becoming more and more user-friendly, and the researchers and users expect more and more to be able to access, even if not archival records, but description of those records online. So if you have, for example, Osredok has many requests from Ukraine, from researchers. And if they see descriptions, if they see the size, the aboutness of those records, they can understand whether it suits their needs, whether it's something they really want to access. You can have you can choose different approach to how you provide access to your archives. The most traditional is creating a finding aid and printing it and having it in your researcher area or public area or wherever you have people visiting, that they can browse through them and this way to learn about your holdings. But again, more and more often it's an online database. It's not only useful for researchers and the end user, it's also useful for archivists, because especially if you have more than one person working, it's really, and you work sometimes from home, and sometimes you volunteer, and sometimes you work from the office. It's really nice to have ability to access this information from different points and to be able to build on the previous work. So if you have your own personal IT person, you can always go for a custom built solution. I know that very few of us have this luxury. I don't have this luxury, unfortunately, in our archives, so we have to manage. But if you do have, you can definitely do it, because the custom built solution would meet your needs the best. However, it has also drawbacks. If you build something from scratch to meet your needs, it means that IT person would need to maintain that piece of software and the infrastructure over the time. So all the necessary updates for the pieces of software and migrating it to maintaining a server, migrating data from one server to another. So you really, it is very labor intensive. And custom built solutions also very often do not support standards. And we just talked about standards. Standards are really important in terms of sustainability of your archival practice. You can sit down, of course, and describe the records that you see in front of you in whatever terms you want. You don't really need to use standards. But if you do use standards, it helps maintain these descriptions over time. It helps in the future, if there is a different standard, to map existing fields to new fields. If it's just a free-flowing narrative or in-house built standard vocabulary or whatever have you, it's really difficult, and basically you have to start from scratch every time. If you use standards, they might feel limiting to in some ways. They may not serve the best and 100% meet your needs, but in the long term, I think it's a win because it helps sustain your descriptions and your records over time and over different software pieces. And one of the examples of archival software that is listed here is ATOM. ATOM stands for Access to Memory. It was initially commissioned by the International Council on Archives in 2003. The idea was that, it would be so nice if all the archives in the world, big and small, could have access to this software. And if they all used it, it would be so nice because it will be standardized. A person from any country would be able to go to this database and understand, because the logic behind it is exactly the same. So it was all very well intentioned, but the money ended real soon. And for a while, nobody looked after this software until the developers, the initial developers who were commissioned to do the work, who are a Canadian company and who are archivists and IT people. They decided to take on this project. So now they maintain it. It's a company called Artifactual. They're based in Vancouver. And it really helps that this software is created by archivists for archivists, because you speak the same language, you understand what your needs are, and they know what they're doing. This is a free software. It's open source. Anyone can go online and download it and install it and have it. However, as I once heard someone explaining, it's free as in free puppies. So yes, you can have them for free, but you have to feed them, you have to clean after them, you have to take them to the vet. So it again involves a lot of this kind of maintenance, and you do need certain skills to be able to do that. although I think it's less skill intensive than the first custom in-house solution. And then the third option that I listed here is online. There are a number of online content management systems that exist out there. If you don't need a lot of storage, there is often a free account option that you can at least try and see if it works for you. Most of these are not really meant for archives and for archival descriptions, so you'll have to really try to fit in. But what they're excellent for is for making your digitized collections available online. Collections of items. This is basically what they're built for. And Omeka is one of those examples. Again, Omeka exists. You can also download it. It's a free software. You can download it and maintain it on your server and customize it to the best of your abilities. But you can also have an online account on OmekaNet, and you can have your own content management system there. I know that many community organizations use Omeka because it's so user-friendly and because it's really easy to understand, even if you only have volunteers and they come only, not even on a regular basis. But if you're serious about archives, I would recommend looking into archival software. Atom, as access to memory, it's used, at least in Canada, it's used by all provincial and territorial councils, with the exception of Quebec, as far as I know. It's used by all university archives. It's used by many international archives. It's used by UNESCO. The list goes on and on and on, and you can go to their website and check. But it's a good piece of software, and it also helps you learn about description, archival description as you go, because of those, tooltips and all the pop-ups that show you that this is what you have to input here, this is what you have to input here, and there's always a standard. Atom supports both international and Canadian archival standards, which is really handy. And you can probably tell that I like it because I'm talking about it a lot. In my role as a database administrator for Alberta and Record for the Archive Society of Alberta, I do administer the database that is based on this software. And also in my day job in my archives at the U of A, we also use this database. All right, we received several questions from you about conservation. And again, we are negotiating with some experts to invite them and to do a separate workshop for this, on this topic. But there are several basic pieces of information that we would like to share with you, because it's a good start. And these are really, really important. And this is something that doesn't necessarily require, some do require investments, but some do not, and you can do it today. So main risks for to preserve your records is, of course, temperature. Cool is better than warm, and of course better than hot. And relative humidity. Between 30 and 50 is ideal. We are lucky here in Alberta most of the time, but I know people on the east and west coast are not as lucky with humidity. And there are special systems that can be installed, but they're quite costly. Saying that 16 degrees temperature is better than 20 is true. However, if your temperature fluctuates, if it jumps from 14 to 18 and then to 22 and then back to 15, it's better if it's at 20 degrees but stable. So these fluctuations are really bad for the physicality of your records, be it paper or tape or film or photograph. And some are more vulnerable than others, but again, this is a topic for a future discussion. Light is also a pollutant, so you do want to keep your archival records in a dark place. If you can have a room that is not in the attic and not in the basement, and which doesn't have windows, it's ideal. If you can have climate control, ideal, of course, but I know that it's not accessible for many of us. Because floods happen every now and then, it is always a good practice to have your bottom shelf with archival records at least a foot above the floor. So you never want to keep your boxes on the floor, because if a flood happens, they will be ruined. Of course, there can be a fire damage, so you always need to be alert and assess situation, identify whether there are hazardous materials, and pests are another threat to archives. And these could be anything from silverfish to mice to, I'm not going to go even there. The link that is listed at the bottom of this slide takes you to Canadian Council on Archives Basic Conservation of Archival Materials resource. It's very accessible, and I recommend you look at it. A few more things about preventative conservation. This is not my picture, but I think I feel about the same when I see rubber bands or on archival documents. I'm sure some of you have had this experience when you unpack something from a box that hasn't been looked at for decades. Those rubber bands stick to, well, first they're not rubbery anymore. They're hard and they stick to your records and they leave color traces, and they're bad. You never want to use them. The same goes for anything metal in your records. You do not want any staples there. You don't want any paper clips. There are plastic paper clips that are often used in archives. They're inert, so they wouldn't react with the paper. They're quite affordable, and you can buy them in bulk. But also, if you use file folders that are acid-free file folders, and you put only a reasonable number of sheets in it, you may not even need those paper clips, because paper clips also add the volume to the box on one side. So you'll need to manage that. And I already mentioned file folders. Archival enclosures are important. They're not just acid-free, they're often buffered, so they can take on some acidity from the records into themselves and buffer it. There are boxes and file folders and transparent enclosures for photographs and negatives. Archival supplies are very pricey. They're very expensive. However, file folders, acid-free file folders, are very affordable nowadays. They're sold in packs of 500, I think, and you can buy them at a reasonable price. So even if you can't afford to buy archival boxes, I would encourage you to still consider spending some funds on file folders. And even if you keep your records in regular boxes, still keep them in archival file folders. There are three archival supplies vendors. Well, not all of them are primarily archives. They're both library and archives. Karma Clean is a Canadian vendor. Very easy to work with, very friendly, great customer service. Shipping is always a question with archival supplies, because some of them are quite bulky. So you always want to check before you purchase something. BroadArt is another popular option to buy archival supplies. I use it very often because on bigger volume, you can get free shipping, which helps in this case, but it can take several months for supplies to get. So again, look at what you need and how urgently you need it, and weigh all those options that you have. And Printfile, it's actually a firm in US, but they produce those transparent enclosures for photographs and negatives and things like that. And they have distributors across Canada. So this is just a link for you to find the one that is the closest to you if you're interested. A few more do's and don'ts. Well, remove oral paper clips, unfold folded records, unroll rolled records. relax, separate, monitor, elevate away from the light. And on the other hand, do not store on the floor in basements or attics, non-window seals. Don't use tape on archival records. Don't laminate them. Don't put any glue on them, anything metal or wood. All of these are really, really bad for preservation. And again, there is another handout that is very useful that you can refer to. We have very little time left, and digital preservation is such a big, big topic that it would take hours and hours to go into any kind of detail into it. But I really wanted to emphasize a few points. First of all, digital preservation does not equal digitization. Many archival institutions obviously want to do digitization projects, and this is wonderful and perfectly fine because digitization does help make records more accessible. However, if you talk to any archivist, they would really caution you against thinking of digitization as preservation measure. Because if you scan your records, preserving those digital files would be more expensive and more difficult than preserving original textual documents. And that's 100% true. So it's better not to think of digitization as a preservation measure, but rather as an access measure for your archives. In some cases, one step back, even if you digitize some records, you always keep the original because archives keep unique original records. You never dispose of them. We talked about evidence and authenticity at the very beginning of this workshop, and having this original helps you ensure this authenticity of information that is contained in your records. When you digitized it, it's really easy to manipulate that file. And there are measures that digital archivists do to prevent that and to ensure authenticity of digital records, but it's a whole new, whole different business. So digitization is not digital preservation. Digital preservation is defined usually as an ongoing active management of digital content over time to ensure ongoing access as long as needed. Which means it's not a project that you can do and have it done. It's an ongoing process. Digital files can rot. Those zeros and ones can disappear. So having a digital file today does not mean that when you open it a month from now or years from now, it will be exactly the same file. There are different standards that are used in digital preservation. For example, file format standards for creating and keeping an archival copy of a file. For example, if you are digitizing your photographs to make them accessible, you want to digitize them at high resolution, usually it's 600 or 1200 dpi, and you want to digitize them as TIFFs because TIFF is a lossless file format. On the other hand, these files are huge. So keeping those huge files, one image can be, 50 megabytes or 100 megabytes, which is a lot if you have thousands of photographs, right? So you also want to have a JPEG copy of the same image as an access copy. This is the copy that you will put in your database, online database, or this is a copy that you will provide access to researchers to. So there are many, many different nuances, and there are these standards for different media, for different situations. Locks is an interesting concept, and it's easier to remember, and it's something that I think most of you probably do already. It stands for lots of copies keep stuff safe. It's not proper digital preservation, but it is one of the steps that are necessary. The standard recommendation is to have 3 exact copies, digital copies of the same records. They should be located geographically distant from each other in case of natural disasters. And it's best if they're stored on different kinds of storage. So for example, you have an online database and one copy is in the cloud, and then you have really good hard drives. So the second copy is on the hard drives. And then maybe you have a very powerful computer at home, not in the office, or the other way around, so geographically distant, and you have a third copy there. So this is the basic rule for having some kind of, it's not a guarantee. Nobody can guarantee that they will be safe, but there are processes that you could do to ensure that digital data is preserved over time and is the same as it was when you received it. And metadata. Metadata is last but definitely not the least, especially with digital files. It is extremely important to describe. Metadata stands for, the usual rule is, its definition is it's data about data. So these are descriptions, and there are different types of metadata. The rights metadata, for example, would detail what permissions users have to use the records, or who owns the copyrights. So things that Irena was talking about. Technical metadata would have information such as the file format, the bitrate for audio file, the file size, and things like that. Administrative metadata would have information about the donor and their contact information, and how these records are positioned within your institution. And descriptive metadata would be mostly about what we already talked about. It would be more about the content of records. And for those who know this all and who are bored listening about basics, here is a nice, I really like this curation life cycle model. I won't be talking much about it, but it's a graphical high-level overview of stages required for successful management and preservation of data. And it can go in cycles. You can look at different cycles at your leisure time if you wish. Here are some resources for you. You might have noticed that some of the definitions that I used were from the dictionary, Society of American Archivists Dictionary of Archives Terminology. It's up to date. It's a very good online resource. If you are not sure what provenance is or what meanings the word archive has, it's really handy. You just type in your search and you can look it up. The second resource, it's I think it's 17-page document developed by Braden. What's Braden's last name? Cannon, who is currently the archivist at the Provincial Archives of Alberta, but he did it when he did his master's degree. It's a very nice, concise guide for specifically for community organizations who want to maintain their organizational archives. The AABC Archivist Toolkit is a great, wonderful resource. It's created by the Archives Association of British Columbia. It's an online resource. It has a ton of links to all kinds of information about archives and archiving, really, really useful. I already mentioned the manual for small archives that has also a sample of archival policy, but I would also encourage you to maybe even print it out and look through it. It's a really good and accessible resource. A guide to maintaining records and identifying archival material for societies and organizations. This one was developed by the provincial government, Saskatchewan Provincial Archives. It is a small document, 5 or 6 pages, but it has like lists of documents that you may want to keep and documents that you probably don't want to keep. So it's really also useful for, especially for those who are just starting organizing their archives. Rules for archival description, 500 pages. And Canadian Conservation Institute notes. These are separate documents that were developed by Canadian Conservation Institute, and they deal with various aspects of preservation and handling of cultural objects. They serve all three sectors of memory institutions, libraries, archives, and museums, but you can definitely find something that would be useful for your situation. And if you have other questions, I know we will be looking at your questions in just a moment, but if in the future you're stuck or you need advice, or even if hopefully after COVID, if you need someone to come and have a look at your records, if we are able to do that, we UCC Archives Committee, we would be happy to do it. If we live in your area, the email is archives@ucc.ca. You can also email me to the Sustainable Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Program. The email is again in the slide, and the top link lists archival associations to different provinces and territories, so you can look up your own association. They're a wealth of information and help. They usually can come, look at your records, consult, provide some advice. Of course, they won't do the work for you, but they have knowledge and skills and expertise to do advising. And it's always great if a person is very close to you geographically and can help. Something I haven't mentioned yet today, and it's surprising even to me, the favorite answer of archivists to any kind of advising question is, it depends. And it's true, because archives are unique. It really depends on your institution, on your mandate, on your needs, on values of your organization, on values of your community, why you're preserving these records, and what for, what uses you can imagine. So in many cases, there is no straight answer. Shall I keep this or not? It depends. Because first you want to look at every single record, not separately, but as a whole. You want to look at all these records as a whole. You want to understand them as one entity, and you want to understand all their interrelationships between them, because that will help them to be preserved properly and to be used much more efficiently. And yes, we got to the question slide. I should have put this one first. Of course, I can't request that you do the homework, but I think it would be useful if after today's workshop, you look at this article that I linked on top. It's a very short article. I think it's 1 page, maybe 1.5 pages, and it's exactly about why an organization, a community organization specifically, may want to maintain their own archives. I would encourage all of you who are volunteers or work for community organizations who have or want to maintain their archives to draft, maybe use the summer to draft archival policy using a template that is available and was provided. Again, if you need some feedback, you can email it to us. We would be happy to go back and forth and provide feedback on the content of your policy. But this is something that is really recommended to start with. You need to see the big picture. You need to know where you're going in order for your work to be efficient. Please discuss it with your board. Get it approved by the board if possible. And if at all possible, consider adding a clause to your bylaws or to your statutes that would state your commitment, not your personal, but the commitment of your organization to maintain the archive, and who is responsible for what, who is passing records to whom when they end their term, and things like that.